Thank you, Celia. You really are very kind in your intro words to Rory and I. So just to outline what we're going to do, we're going to have a bit of a chat. I think we're going to enjoy it, and if you do as well, then so much the better. Basically, there are going to be 4 chapters, each of 10 minutes, so 4 sort of pre-assigned topics, and a bit of back and forth. So I'm going to kind of interview Rory for the first chapter, and then back and forth a bit. But the premise of all of this is obviously about thinking differently, which has many aspects, and we're going to try and cover a few. I think it was Einstein who said the definition of insanity was doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. So hopefully this is a good brain juicer to how all we can think a little bit differently. And then we have got a couple of pre-registered questions, so we'll try and remove some of those, and then we'll find our way through some of the questions. I can see also already, Chris, your question coming in here. I would say up front, neither of us are the very best timekeepers that the world has ever known. So we'll do our best to stick to that. But you know, lots of caveats and provisos in that. But nonetheless, let's get started. So first off, I'm going to ask Rory about his spin on thinking differently. And I suppose the obvious thing, Rory, is you sort of made best part of a good career out of this notion that things that seem absurd are actually very sensible and very commercial. So what's the value of thinking differently to you?
Well, I suppose the first thing is very simple observation, which is if you look at 10 really remarkable and successful businesses, and you imagine that they didn't exist, and you imagine trying to launch them 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it's worth remembering that you would have faced an extraordinary level of skepticism. Dyson would be one example. If you know, I'll be honest, I've got a fair old appetite for counterintuitive ideas, but if someone had come to me and said, I think there's a market for a £700 vacuum cleaner, I would have kind of gone, yeah, I think this guy is slightly unhinged, to be honest, because you look at the vacuum cleaner market, it's a distressed purchase. It's a grudge purchase in many cases. You only really buy one if you're forced to move out of rented accommodation. You try and blag one from your parents if possible. You know, have you got a spare one? It's not like we're going to get a great thrill out of vacuum cleaner purchase. And if you looked at the market, you'd see kind of the Henry at the left and the Miele at the right, and the sweet spot, the center of the kind of Gaussian distribution of vacuum cleaner price would be around sort of £170. And you go, okay, this guy's deranged, essentially. And then if he said, no, but wait, you haven't heard about my idea for the £400 hairdryer, that's when you would have actually got him shown out of the building, really. But then on the other hand, he's a billionaire and I'm not. And I could make the same case about Red Bull. Cost a fortune, comes in a tiny can, tastes disgusting. Okay, I can make the same case, bottled water as a category. I grew up, you know, at a time when the only person in Britain who had bottled water was the Queen, who I think travelled with a supply of Malvern water to avoid stomach upsets. But that was basically it. If you bought bottled water when I was a kid, you were some sort of nut job. Okay, you could look at, for example, Zoom. When Zoom launched, everybody said, perfectly rationally, they said, look, guys, basically, you're up against Facebook, Google, Amazon. All of the big tech players already have a video conferencing platform. Skype was bought by Microsoft for $1 billion or so. And they're free. What on earth makes you think you can make a go of this in a world with a freemium model when you're up against these tech giants who are offering competing products for zilch? And funnily enough, the most recent one I've come across is Gusto, in a way, which I don't know if anybody else is a convert. But I actually met the guy who founded Gusto. It's now worth about £1 billion, by the way. And I met him, and he got in touch with me and said, he was very interested in behavioural science. I'll send you a Gusto box. Now, I'm not so rude or so ungrateful that I turned down free food, and I wasn't going to say, I don't want your stinking box of food. But I must admit, I was fairly sceptical. I thought, well, okay, I've got 6 cookbooks on my kitchen shelves, or 10 or 15. My wife is largely the guardian of those things. And I've got the whole Elizabeth David and Claudia Rosen and this and that. I've got an Ocado account. I can get a recipe from a cookbook, order the ingredients from Ocado, make the meal. What on earth does Gusto achieve for me? Now, the extraordinary thing is this box arrived at gousto.co.uk. If you're very good on the chat, I'll send you a recommendation code for a half price first box towards the end of this talk. So that's an incentive to hold on. But the strange thing is this box arrived and I ended up making 4 meals, which were totally delicious. And I suddenly realized, okay, when everything arrives simultaneously, you actually make a kind of, reasonable sort of high quality. It's particularly good for ethnic food, which of course has lots and lots of fiddly little spices and things. And it's unlikely you have all of those in stock. And I realized in a way that all of these things are kind of behavioral tech. They're psych tech. What they solve isn't a logistics problem. It's not that we can't get hold of food or that we can't get hold of cookbooks. It's that by making the process simultaneous, you end up cooking far more high quality meals at, by the way, a totally sane and healthy quantity than you ever did before. And actually, when I investigated it a bit further, I discovered that although cookbooks basically support the publishing industry, you'd be better off buying your mum a copy of the Kama Sutra for Christmas, to be honest, if you wanted her actually to implement the advice contained therein, because everybody buys cookery books, and a tiny, tiny fraction of people make more than one recipe from every hardback 20 quid book they receive. So this solves the behavioral problem. It's a coordination problem in a way. I think that Uber, the great genius of Uber at the beginning, was the map, which was a psychological problem. It wasn't that we really minded waiting for a cab. It was that we hated the state of uncertainty. That business of, is he here yet? Maybe he's parked around the corner. Oh, hold on. They said 10 minutes. Why isn't he here now? And the little map with a little picture of a car on it doesn't solve the problem in objective terms. It doesn't make the car arrive any faster, but it completely solves the problem in psychological terms. And I suddenly realized that what people actually want, what those unspoken, unthought, unmet needs are, in many cases. No one before Starbucks was going around going, why can't I spend $3.50 on a cup of coffee? Why does this coffee have to be so cheap, right? Okay, nobody before this explosion, I don't know if this is a bit of a male one, but the Turkish barber craze. There wasn't anybody in market research saying, I really like my barber, but I just wish he'd flick burning methylated spirit into my ears. You never got that, okay? And so you suddenly realize that our unmet needs are not only unmet, they're kind of unthought and they're unspoken. And that's because we want things for reasons other than the reasons we can rationalize. And yet we have this extraordinary bias within business decision-making, which is the quality of a decision is basically assumed to be proportionate to the extent to which it makes sense, okay? And in many ways, your risk of getting fired doesn't depend on the quality of your decision-making in business. It depends on the quality of your reasoning and your argumentation. And I think that's a really dangerous conflation in many cases, because to quote my colleague Chris Graves, who founded the Ogilvy Center for Behavioral Science in New York, just because something makes sense doesn't mean it's true. And just because something doesn't make sense doesn't mean it's wrong. And we have this incredibly strong human urge, I think, to make sense of the world, that we need to construct usable maps. And it's a little like if God didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent him. We need kind of religions and rules and, common patterns by which we can lead our lives. And I think we leap to these much, much too quickly, because we go, why does that happen? It's because of this, right? Done that, done the explanation, nothing to see here. Toothpaste, why do we clean our teeth? Because we want to prevent dental decay. And yet if you look deep down at the real behavior of toothbrushing, it's really about fear of bad breath much more than it is about dental health. Dental health is the official reason. That's the reason you'd give in court if you were asked to explain why you had cleaned your teeth that morning. And that's probably how the human faculty of reason evolved. It was to effectively defend ourselves and explain our behavior to other people. And so we just come up with one plausible reason and then we stop. But actually, why is all of the world's toothpaste flavored with mint? I don't even like mint. Well, nothing beats mint for a feeling of having a fresh mouth and fresh breath. So do you actually clean your teeth after lunch? No, you don't. You clean your teeth before you go to bed? Probably not. Do you clean your teeth before you go to work, or before a date, or before sex? I mean, if you're in a relatively recent relationship, that is, almost certainly you do. And so you realize that the real deep down amygdala reason doesn't really map onto the official reason at all. And since the whole job of marketing is to find and satisfy unmet needs, and unmet needs are unvoiced and unthought, then it means that marketers can't be confident operating in a world where everything has to make sense straight out of the gate. That's it, basically.
Thanks, Rory. I mean, as ever, you've got brilliant examples of where what might seem absurd is obviously very successful. Just to reassure everybody, Rory doesn't have any commission on the Kama Sutra.
No.
Actually, I'm shuddering slightly at that one in terms of the thought.
I would get 15 quid if you signed up for Gusto, though, so I better come clean on that one.
There you go. Good to get everything out in the open.
Yeah, get it all clear. Yeah.
But just to flip it around the other way, you give the brilliant examples, but what's the opportunity cost of not looking for these obtuse and bizarre and different and seemingly irrational examples? So if you've got a sort of in the negative where it's gone wrong or not being capitalized upon, the best ideas that never happened, perhaps, just to frame it in the counter.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting one would be Zoom, by the way, where the opportunity cost would be, there are several ways in which you pay a very, very high price, I think, for being rational. One of which it's impossible to do anything that isn't rational, which means that human needs, which humans themselves don't understand because they lack the introspective power to understand them, remain completely unmet. The other possibility is that by failing to work out how to sell something, you do something which, when you think about it, is the most wasteful thing you can possibly do in economic terms, which is to produce a brilliant product that nobody realizes is brilliant. And so, and by the way, I think that happens quite a lot, by the way. You can produce a product which people think is expensive because you've never framed it in the right way. And the third way in which you pay a price, I think, for insisting on rationality is that rationality always gets you to the same place as everybody else. So if you start off by looking at the market for vacuum cleaners, and here we go, there we are, I've just put up the Gusto code. If you start off assuming that the way in which to extrapolate, the way in which to predict human behavior is typically done in business and in government, actually, in three ways. There's market research. Now it's not useless, but it's patently incomplete because we don't really have full introspective access to our own motivations. The second thing we tend to use is economic logic, which is, if we drop the price, demand will go up, etc. And the third thing we use tends to be extrapolation from past data. And all three of those are actually limiting. And all three of them, even when used in combination, can fail to give you the full picture. By the way, it's particularly dangerous at a time of major disruption like COVID to become preoccupied with data models based on past behavioral data, because what you're doing there is optimizing on the past. And in a sense, you're designing something for a world that may no longer exist. So in a sense, the more disruption you have in a marketplace, 4 years ago, British Airways could fairly safely say, which are the routes where we see high profitability and increasing demand? And that might be, Heathrow to Nashville or something, okay? Where are the routes where we see declining demand and lower profitability? Okay, so we'll extrapolate forwards and we'll increase supply on the Nashville route, we'll reduce supply on the, London to Paris, for example, where the Eurostar's, essentially taking over. Now, that would be fairly safe if you have a period of incredibly high consistency. But always remember, all big data comes from the same place, okay? The past. Okay. And actually, if you want to understand what behavior is going to be like in the future, you've got to go deeper into human psychology, and you'll suddenly realize, for example, that people will suddenly want to travel on the Eurotunnel because it's the only way you can actually leave the country while staying in a bubble, for example. But none of that would be predicted by past data because the conditions in which that data was collected are totally different to the conditions today. And so I think what we do is we create this illusion of rationality around our decision making. And Gerd Gigerenzer calls this defensive decision making. I mean, an awful lot of decisions are also post-rationalized. We make them emotionally, and then we spend a lot of time. So that's a fourth price you pay, is that you make a decision emotionally, and then you spend a lot of time basically assembling the numbers to justify your instinct. Which, sometimes is, by the way, creates artificial confidence and all sorts of selection bias, but it can also actually lead just to a huge amount of wasted time. I mean, if you're going to do that anyway, why not just go and do it? I mean, I always tease clients about this because you know that business when procurement give you a balanced scorecard for choosing an agency, and they give you all those little factors like strategic insight, creative ability, chemistry, but then 50% of it's probably price because it's procurement after all, right? Okay, and so what you're supposed to do as a client is you're supposed to score every agency presentation according to those little measures, and then you'll see which one has the highest number and you award them the business. Now, my point is, do your bollocks. No, you decide who you want to win and then you backfill the numbers to get the result you wanted all along. Okay, now every client has admitted that to me, at least after a couple of drinks, that nobody actually uses that mathematical process to arrive at the decision. And nor should you, by the way, because it probably isn't additive. Okay, I mean, let's say chemistry is only 10%, but you come across me and a bunch of my colleagues and you really, really hate us, right? You shouldn't give us the business, no matter how good we are at anything else, because you're not going to produce good work working with people you can't stand, right? So, you know, maybe we're right to ignore that new mathematical model as well, because it's not really an additive model. You know, I mean, a car that scored really well on 9 dimensions, but looked absolutely, you know, it had a large inflatable penis on the roof. Okay, you can score it 0 for appearance, but let's face it, you're not going to buy that car under any circumstances, right? And so, you know, decisions are, the way in which we instinctively weight decisions is not easily captured in mathematical form, by the way. And sometimes that means that individual instinctive decisions actually embrace a whole range of data and information which a model simply can't capture. And this is one of the things that really worries me, is we don't have SI units for things like, well, if you take Uber, uncertainty, okay? So a lot of engineers at British Airways are trying to improve the punctuality of the flights. And I said to British Airways, look, people prefer their flights to be punctual. I'm not saying, why don't you just be randomly late and, you know, fly random timetables, okay? But I said, you could spend millions trying to improve punctuality. And my argument is you could achieve the same emotional effect among passengers just by having better information at the airport, okay? Because emotionally, I don't like my plane being late, but I'm not really, but if it says delayed 30 minutes, to be honest, well, I might be pleased because I might have been running late now I can catch the plane after all, okay? I might even be pleased, but I'm not going to, you know, I go, okay, 30 minutes, I'll spend a bit longer in the lounge. You know, I'm at Geneva Airport once, I had a flight delayed by an hour, went and got my hair cut, you know, okay? But actually, the real disaster wasn't the fact that the plane was late, it was that the information given to passengers was simply BA246 delayed. Not delayed 40 minutes, not delayed an hour, just delayed. That drives us insane, you see. And so it's uncertainty, it's certainty that we're actually craving, not punctuality. And you can solve that problem psychologically at literally 0.1% of the cost of solving the problem with logistics and engineering. Actually, in insurance, I'll give you a few interesting cases in insurance. You know, it's interesting, by the way, that I think a lot of people lie on their insurance forms when they try and take out motor insurance, okay? And the reason they're lying is because they're uncertain about what telling the truth costs them, okay? So I might go, well, actually, my car isn't, strictly speaking, garaged overnight, because let's face it, I mean, unless you were born in 1910, who the hell garages their car overnight? But the only alternative I've got on that form is parked on the street. Now, it's not parked on the street, it's parked a long way from the nearest public road, okay? So I'm just going to say garaged here, you know, because if I tell the truth and say parked on a driveway, okay, that might be costing me 150 quid a year. And, you know, I feel a bit hard done by. Now, if I lied and said garaged, and then I got to the end of the process and it said, by the way, if you don't want to garage your car every night, the extra cost for parked on the street is 20 quid a year, nearly everybody would pay 20 quid to know they tell the truth. It's the fear that they might be paying 150 created by the non-transparency of the insurance quotation process, which is causing people to tell porkies. So there's actually a way in which people could recover their truthfulness at the end if you're able. The other weird one you never do, which baffles me, is you never go upgrade from third-party fire and theft to comprehensive for only X. You asked me at the beginning, which of these forms of insurance do you want? Okay, now I'm willing to bet that comprehensive insurance is quite a bit more lucrative than third-party fire and theft. Also, of course, punters wildly overestimate the insurance cost of scratches and dents, and they underestimate basically driving into a bus queue. So they tend to think that comprehensive insurance must be a lot more than third-party fire and theft or third party, okay? But none of the processes I've ever been through have said, okay, this is your quote for third party, but you can upgrade to comprehensive for another X pounds a year. Now, that strikes me as weird, because you've asked me to make a decision on which kind of insurance I want without telling me the price difference. And interestingly, I mean, it's a really, really interesting thing, because what we noticed is that, you know, an awful lot of websites do that. They ask you to make a decision before you have the full information necessary to actually decide on it. And so you know, I think understanding just the deep instinctive ways in which humans have evolved to sort of think, decide and act, or feel, decide and act might be a more accurate phrase. I just think it's essential to marketing, because otherwise we'll end up in this kind of rationalist Minecraft model of human behavior, which is, you're all very neat and cubic, but it doesn't really relate to reality very much.
So thanks, Rory. Thanks for the tips on insurance. I've made a few notes there. Also, just you reminded me that the best agency decision I ever made, which was Saatchi's for the work we did on Direct Line, I had the hairs standing up on the back of my neck, and that was what made the decision for me. And I remember actually getting quite angry with one person in the pitch who had a different point of view. You know, not in a sort of violent way or anything, but was I predisposed, and therefore physiologically the hair standing up on the back of my neck was part imagined or part real. But anyway, that's the end of chapter 1. We're probably going to do 3 chapters rather than 4, because we've had you know, a bit of time past there. So I'm now going to hand to you, and you're going to come back at me on chapter 2.
Oh, excellent. So this is a brilliant point, because it's about neurodiversity, and I'm probably in. I'll tell you a very interesting story, because I've just got off a podcast with the evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson. And he tells a really important story about chickens. Okay. Now, what happens apparently is, if you take chickens, which tend to be battery farmed, and they tend to be in cages of about 12 chickens each. Okay. And if you if you look at chickens one by one, and you breed from the chickens that individually produce the most eggs, what actually ends up happening, weirdly, is not what you'd expect. You don't get a super productive cage of chickens. You actually get a cage full of psycho chickens who are effectively pecking each other, and the entire cage is dysfunctional, and it produces remarkably few eggs. If you breed from the cages that are most productive, okay, so you just say this cage has produced on average more eggs than the other cage, so we'll breed from that cage. You actually increase your egg yield. And so this is essentially a kind of model of what evolutionists call group selection, which is, evolution doesn't just operate at the level of the gene or the individual, it also operates at the level of groups. And that cooperative groups outcompete uncooperative groups, even if uncooperative individuals outcompete cooperative individuals. And so it always strikes me that the way in which we look to hire, which is we assume that 10 optimal decisions will lead to an optimal team. In other words, that the optimal company is the aggregation of individual optimal hires, you know, strikes me as really, really dangerous. And I think, I mean, I'm old enough to say, I don't know if you think the same thing. I think the people who did our university admissions, they weren't under quite such pressure to be totally fair, okay? And I think they did an element of group selection. They chose some people because they were academically absolutely top flight, but they chose people, to be honest, like me, who were a bit academically on the borderline, but we seemed a bit interesting or weird, okay? That's how I got hired at Ogilvy. There were 4 people, and I think they decided on the other 3 fairly quickly, and somebody at the back said, okay, we've got 1 job left, we've got 3 possible candidates, let's take a punt on the weirdo. Now, I think if there'd only been 1 job, or if there'd been 4 jobs which had been interviewed for individually, I don't think I would have got any of those 4 jobs. And so the business in which we select people one at a time on the assumption that an optimal group of people is simply an aggregate of optimal individual hires strikes me as fundamentally wrong, and that neurodiversity and cognitive diversity is actually a group strength, which we're not selecting for at all. So I'd love to know your opinions on this, because I know it's been a real level of enthusiasm for you for quite some time.
Rory, you are terrible at elongating a question. But
sorry, yeah, that was, but yeah.
But it was beautiful to listen to you nonetheless. So I've not thought of chickens, but I don't know if anybody's read Matthew Syed's Rebel Ideas, where he talks about, just in the opening actually, that 9/11 really came about because of the selection processes of the CIA. 99.9% were white male, well-educated Protestants, and 0% Muslim, had no understanding of that that perspective, and in the rearview mirror, they selected the very best individuals according to their definition, and so completely missed a few obvious things along the way. So yeah, I mean, my reference to this is that the case for diversity is compelling from a performance point of view. It's been proven time and time again. But I think there's sort of three tiers to this. So the A-level answer is demographic diversity, and that's what CIA got it wrong. I think the degree level answer is cognitive diversity, as in it's really what you're after is difference of thought. Yes, there's a social justice element to diversity, but the performance side, it's about cognitive diversity. And so therefore the PhD answer is neurodiversity, because if you're after cognitive diversity, actively look for the brains which are definitionally wired differently at source, i.e. from birth. So I just think it's sort of the next stage of maturity around the whole diversity conversation. Just in terms of, why would I care about this? Because best I know, I'm neurotypical. Is that my daughter was diagnosed at the age of 8 with dyslexia, and it explained a lot of things. It was almost like a good label for her, because she'd hit a brick wall at school. The reality is, for her, she could do some amazing things uniquely. They were almost effortless that I couldn't imagine doing. But yet, ask her to spell or to read, and it was nigh on impossible. So that was my entry point over 10 years ago into the good, the bad, and the ugly of a brain that's wired differently, and it made me really passionate. And some people say, as men, I got into the gender conversation because I had a daughter, and I think that's okay, but you probably should have been interested before that. But genuinely, it's only through my daughter's eyes that I really got interested. But I started to realise this thing, which was that she could do amazing things, and I in my own mind I came to think of that as sort of superpowers and hidden superpowers. And so the reason this conversation is important is twofold. One is social justice would say it's only fair that everybody gets a chance to fulfil their potential. And in a world where visible disability gets a greater share of voice, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, it is often the case that invisible disabilities are somewhat concealed. And I suppose you could say, well, it's not a competition, different aspects of diversity. Well, actually, no, it is. It is a competition, because every organisation has only so much sort of airtime or money or whatever it is to focus. But it's the performance one which is really intriguing to me. And if you've spent a life, really, my whole career is predicated on the success I had in team sport. And it may seem slightly obtuse, but I think rugby is a game of diversity, or at least it was. Let's put aside gender or ethnicity. In terms of the functional role of every individual, it's quite different. And each role has a specific value add. More so, the game is becoming everyone's a bit of an orc. But back in the day, it was the different roles that made the team. So I just think it's a bit of a tragedy that the conversation doesn't get enough airtime. Although I do think that is improving massively. And of course, the number of examples of people who fulfill that superhero category. Einstein, dyspraxic, couldn't tie his laces up, dyslexic, autistic, and yet one of the most brilliant minds that the planet has ever known. So I think it's the place where breakthrough thinking happens. And for us at Direct Line, I suppose we've really got behind this in our practices and approach, and I can share a little bit more of that. But I just think it's it's sort of this hidden superpowers, which really, to be honest with you, bloody annoys me, because for me it's about getting everybody having the chance to fulfill their individual potential. But so often it doesn't happen, and the reality is this isn't a one-way bet. People with neurodiversity over-index on homelessness, mental health issues, and imprisonment. So it's it's not just a it's a broader conversation, in fact.
They can index very well on entrepreneurialism. And I think there was a time when, at the height of Tesco's success, I think half of its board of directors were dyslexic, which is, I mean, it's highly unlikely that's pure coincidence, I would say. Michael Heseltine famously, it does seem to be quite common among entrepreneurs possibly because you simply see things that other people don't. And so I have a very interesting argument about this, which is I'm probably the only person who argues that there should be more than one London tube map. Because when everybody sees the same map, they all respond to it in the same way. And you get too many people using the central line because it's red and goes in a straight line from east to west. And you get too few people using the best line probably is the Victoria line, actually, because it's the fastest. But on the map, because the Victoria line was added comparatively late, it goes in a ridiculous curve. So it looks like a very inefficient way of getting to your destination. In reality, it doesn't go in a curve. It was made to go in a curve in order to fit onto the map. And so it gets hugely underused. And I think there should be, a third of the maps should show the central line as curvy and wiggly and the Victoria line as straight, okay? Because that way, overall, people will make optimal use of the whole system. And so I think what happens is that when you select for exactly the same thing in people, and we're doing this twice because the universities are selecting in the same way, and then businesses are using your university performance as the sole metric for whether you get a first interview. By the way, no one gives a shit 5 years in. Okay, it's not like this is a fantastic proxy for performance, because I had a mate who got a double first in maths from Cambridge, got a job at Goldman Sachs. Okay, and I said to him, how long is it before your first in maths becomes not very valuable in terms of getting your next job? And he said, after 3 years it's secondary, after 5 years it's irrelevant. All they want to know is you've worked with this guy at Goldman, you worked in this team here, you did that, okay? Nobody really cares about your first in maths. It got you in the door in the first place, but it's not what actually people are looking for, because how well you do a job is a much better indicator of how good you are at a job than how good you are at jumping through hoops set by a bunch of academics, in a weird place, 200 miles away, 6 years ago. So it's not, Google has done work which shows that university performance and degree class doesn't correlate with work performance very well at all. Okay. And yet we use these as kind of proxy measures to defend our own decision making. I don't know if anybody's been watching Industry, which is that it's obviously it's kind of like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and it's all about the graduate trainees. And the interesting thing about that program Industry is the girl from Binghamton who's faked her way in, because she actually had to get a friend to fake her degree certificate from what was a kind of supposedly a second-ranked university. Although I didn't realize that. I thought it was pretty prestigious. It's a New York university in upstate New York. Okay, she's the only interesting character in the entire program. The rest of them you'd line up against a wall and have shot, to be absolutely honest. Okay, and you start to realize that if we start implying these same metrics to everybody, it's a very low risk way of making a decision if you need to justify your decision, but we end up actually paying for it really, really heavily. And the strange thing is, by the way, we understand this in terms of music and sport, don't we? So we understand that if you're really sporting, you might go to this university. If you're really musically talented, you might go to the Royal College of Music. If you're brilliantly artistically talented, you wouldn't go to Oxford or whatever. You'd go to, Central St. Martin's or whatever, and spend 3 years in paint-stained dungarees, okay? And we understand that with those three fields, but we don't understand it. Then there's this whole field of business where we're essentially looking for the same goddamn thing. And it seems terribly worrying to me, because the complementary maps of the world, that would have prevented the financial crisis, by the way. It probably would have prevented 9/11, as you said. The people were all looking at this in the same level. And actually, of course, the risk of suicide bombing was totally underrated, because nobody in that particular kind of mindset understood the mentality that would do that. Yeah. And so I think there's something really terrible here, which is, and big data, I think, will make it worse. I also find it really disturbing that we're looking at diversity so heavily in terms of ethnicity and gender, okay? And now, I've got to be really careful here, because when I start saying this, people say, are you saying that unconscious bias doesn't exist? No, of course I'm not saying that, okay? But there are lots of unconscious biases. There are also lots of institutional and network biases. So that, I mean, I'll tell you this lovely story, okay, which is there's a guy at the BBC who runs this department, and he had to submit his diversity figures. And the diversity only doesn't capture your social background at all. Doesn't, you know, it just says, what's your ethnic group, what's your gender? And he says, I'm going to do fine because I'm 60% female and about 50% of my staff or something, or 40% of my staff are of Indian origin. And his friend burst out laughing. And his friend was Indian. And he said, what's so funny? He said, do you not realise? He said, no. 95% of your staff are actually from the Brahmin caste, which is about, actually, they're probably Gujarati Brahmin, who are about 6% or 5% of the Indian population. So to him, it looked like a really diverse department. To his Indian friend, it looked like the crowd at the Eton and Harrow match. And if we're only, I'm starting to think I shouldn't fill in those forms which ask for my ethnicity and gender. Because if that's the only data we collect, then all we'll do is we'll look at disparities of outcome between people according to gender and ethnicity. We'll try then and assume single causality, which is it's all about ethnic prejudice. There are tens of different, and the funny thing Campaign did, okay, here's a really funny thing. They had 50 female faces to watch in 2019, all right? Now, it's a bit controversial saying this, but basically nearly all of them were, if you'd taken the page to people on the street and said, who are these people? They might have said models, okay? Because every single one of them was well above the median for physical attractiveness, okay? Now, the best attested bias in psychology is towards tall people and attractive people. That's easily the best attested bias in all hiring and decision-making, okay? Now, if you're only looking, now obviously you can't ask the form, what's your ethnic origin? You know, I put white, British, male, bit on the ugly side, bit poor, you know, you can't ask those questions, and there isn't really a measure for them. There isn't a number you can attach or a classification to physical attractiveness. But it doesn't mean it doesn't matter, okay? You know, I mean, anybody middle-aged and female in advertising is brilliant, okay? I'll say that confidently. Because the biases towards youth in advertising and the, you know, and the biases towards youth among females is probably greater than that among males. Okay, so every single person I meet who's middle-aged and female in marketing is basically fantastic. And I think that's because if you can survive in this game against those biases, you've got to be pretty damn good. You know, and I think likewise, if you meet anybody who's neurodiverse in advertising, you can confidently say, okay, this person is really worth paying attention to. There's another really interesting thing, by the way, about the spectrum. Asperger's say, if you're on the spectrum, which is oddly, they're very, very good at understanding human behavior and psychology because you've got to work it out for yourself. Okay? So if you're, you know, if you're neurotypical, you just go, oh, I wouldn't wear an anorak to a job interview because, you know, it sends the wrong signals. Okay, and you'd instinctively know that you wouldn't turn up to an interview in an anorak or trainers or something like that. Now, if you're actually, you know, if you're slightly on the spectrum there, you go, well, it's raining, it's a cold day, so an anorak is an extremely, as it is, an extremely practical form of clothing on a cold, wet day. So why wouldn't I wear, you know? And then you've got to work out all the weird social nuances for yourself. So they're in your conscious mind rather than your unconscious. So in some ways, you have this really valuable insight into weirdo neurotypicals and the strange prejudices that drive them.
So Rory, just to come in, you said a couple of interesting things. You get what you measure, but be careful what you measure, I suppose, from the data.
Well, we're only measuring gender and ethnicity. Well, what, you know, what about some guy who grew up in a crack den? I mean, he might be white and male, right? You know, exactly. You know. Just
on the CIA example, there was somebody who said, this is a risk. We need to start looking for everybody who's registering to fly planes of a Muslim origin, and everyone ignored it. So there you go. But just on the entrepreneurial point,
there were these guys. There was a guy who reported from Phoenix who said there are a load of people from Saudi Arabia who've registered for flying lessons, and the weird thing about them is they're not remotely interested in knowing how to land a plane. Okay, that's a bit of a clue. I think they're really interested in they're really interested in flying the plane in flight, not very interested in takeoff, and they're totally uninterested in landing. No, okay.
Just on the entrepreneurial point. I've spoken to many entrepreneurs who say that their neurodiversity as being the causes of their success. So they've been successful because of neurodiversity rather than despite it. Just one example. So Pip Jameson, many people will be aware of, founder of the DOTS, which I hope is the sort of the LinkedIn beta in time. And she struggled through conventional education, did get a place at university, found her groove, got a distinction in economics, and wrote an email to her father saying, I told you I'm a genius. Of course, what she actually wrote was, I told you I'm a Guinness, because she can't spell for toffee. And therein lies the beauty of the whole situation. But we are a bit tight on time. So what I was going to do was just talk a little bit about what I've learned about how to break into this within an organisation, because sometimes it's a bit hard to sort of grip. You know, where do you get started? And just not to oversimplify, but I think there is a simple 1, 2, 3 to get this started in your organisation if it hasn't already. The first thing is you have to give birth to the conversation and make it just a normalized conversation. And to be honest with you, D&I generally becoming so much more prominent helps. But actually, the obvious way to do that is to get people in to talk directly to your staff, to your leadership. So Pip did come into direct line, and really it helped us to unlock the conversation. We had a number of neurodiverse people who really helped us to give birth to the conversation, made it sort of part of the cultural lexicon. Then the second thing, really importantly, comes before you jump to going out and recruiting a bunch of people, which is to nurture the talent that you have internally. So sort of, water the plants that you have. Because of course, with 1 in 7 people being neurodiverse, you already do have a sizable part of your population who are neurodiverse. And that has 2 parts. This is making reasonable adjustments for your neurodiverse staff. And in fact, that's kind of law. So that's a thing. But there are many ways that, and often free or very cheap, you can make reasonable adjustments for your employees. But the other key part of that is that never happens unless you do pay for diagnosis. So we pay for autism, ADHD and dyslexia diagnoses. And people managers are trained in how to have the right conversations around this and how to provide the right support and how to see through the reasonable adjustments process. And then, and only then, I think you're then into a world where you know enough about how to credibly recruit, how to manage the processes to screen, to avoid negative screening, about how to retain the people that you might end up recruiting if you were successful in recruiting. So I just think it's a structured approach which really gets there. Because the reason I say this is many people jump to, we've got to fix our ads, we've got to set ourselves some quotas of targets for recruiting in, but unfortunately it's not a shortcut in that regard. So anyway, that's just my experience there. But what I'm going to do now is
Brilliant.
We said 40 minutes conversation, and then we said 20 minutes pulling in some questions. So we're going to divert to that. I can see there's a couple of brilliant questions already. So we'll definitely get to yours.
I'll also mention, by the way, introversion versus extroversion. And one of the problems with marketing is it's always easier for extroverts to bully introverts than the other way around. Okay. And so one of the interesting things about, the COVID and the sudden adoption of flexible working, without turning this into a conversation, is for many people, it's interesting how many people prefer it this way. And you realize that I'm slightly odd because everybody assumes I'm an extrovert because I'm happy going up on stage and going, hello, Wembley, every now and then. Okay. But oddly, I find it very, very tiring. So long social events, I find absolutely exhausting. And what I realize is that the reason I do that is it's much better for me to speak to 200 people simultaneously than it is to speak to 200 people one at a time. Okay, so what I do is I get all my sociability, out there in a short burst of presentation, and then I go and retire to my hotel room and watch Sky News in my underpants for 3 hours, And there's a great thing at the very beginning of COVID where someone said, introverts be kind to extroverts, they don't know how this works. And I've realized the extent to which we have been, particularly in marketing, kind of bullying people around sociability, in a sense. That there are plenty, and the open plan office, I think, is an assault on the introvert, really.
Yeah, I mean, just as an observation, over the last few days, we do Chief Executive Awards every year. It's a really lovely thing to do. Usually we have a big razzmatazz dinner. Of course, we can't do that in COVID. So all ExCo members have been dropping into team meetings surreptitiously under a bit of a ruse. and then sort of breaking cover and presenting awards. But it's a great way to have a really open and honest conversation, because everyone's guard is kind of down. And universally, the people who are most explicitly saying that they're struggling would classify themselves as the social butterflies,
yeah,
and are really hating lockdown. And for other people who would generally be more quiet and mild and introvert, are saying they've loved the sort of the democratization of COVID. So two things really. One, everybody gets a chance to talk, because it's just sort of polite that you go around all the boxes on the rectangle. And the second is everyone has to listen. And I heard something really interesting the other day, which is listening has two aspects: listening to win or listening to learn. And listening to win is when, and we all do it, you're just waiting for that moment to say the thing you plan to say, even though maybe the conversation has moved on. And you're not really genuinely listening. Whereas listening to learn is following the conversation and being more intuitive in your responses. So maybe one of the silver linings of COVID. Now I'm very conscious that I'm going to hand back to Celia, I think, for a moment, or to Philippa, who's going to do a little bit of a trailer, I think, and then we're going to come back for a bit more Q&A. Did I get that right, Celia?
Yes, that's right. So we're going to hand over to Philippa, and then we'll come back to the two of you for Q&A. So welcome, Philippa. Philippa is the head of fundraising and communications of autism at Kingwood, and she's going to briefly tell us a little bit about their work and why she took on the role, and how specifically we can use our skills to support their work. So thanks very much, Philippa.
Great, thank you. I'm actually filling in for our chief exec today, and I'll talk a little bit about the organisation, and I'll go straight into what our sort of current marketing challenge, if that's okay. So Autism at Kingwood is a registered charity, and we support adults with autism across the Thames Valley. The charity was set up by Dame Stephanie Shirley in 1994 to support her severely autistic son Giles. She took him out of effectively a locked ward in a hospital setting, and moved him into a regular home in an Oxfordshire village, where he was supported by caring support staff. And they provided person-centred support, enabling Giles to make the choice about his life and a level of independence that he desired or could achieve. And that was a real first for him. And those values of being person-centred and enabling hold true with the charity today. And we now support over 130 individuals. So in the autism world, we have a saying, it's when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And autism is so diverse, as you know, and that's true for our charity and the kind of support that we provide. Some people we support require 24-hour care in a supported living model, maybe with a few other people, and they're supported by a team of dedicated support staff. Then they may not be verbal, they may need a 2-to-1 ratio of support when they go out. The level of autism varies. Other people we support require what we call outreach, where we provide a few hours of support per day or per week, enabling the individual to achieve independence and to live independently, and we help them achieve their everyday tasks. All of this work is possible because of our incredible frontline care workers, and we employ about 250 people to support our beneficiaries. But the one thing that we've always had difficulty with, and especially during the pandemic, is the rate of pay that we are paying our social care workers. Over the years, we've tried to show our gratitude with words and deeds, but honestly, it's never been enough. And our frontline workforce really deserve and need more pay. And during the pandemic, they've cancelled holidays, stayed away from their family, and risked their health to support vulnerable autistic adults, and all for a starting salary of £8.74 per hour. So during the pandemic, I had a conversation with Kate Allen, our chief exec. We had to do more. And the problem is that our salaries that we pay are dependent on the income we get from local authorities. So we devised a campaign, Better Pay for Social Care, and an online petition calling on government to increase funding to local authorities to ensure all social care workers, and we have 1.52 million in the country, they receive the minimum of the real living wage. And that's been calculated by the Real Living Wage Foundation. It's £9.50 outside London, £10.75 I think inside. And we've shared the costings to illustrate how current local authority funding isn't enough to pay social care workers the real living wage, in the hope that we'll provide a better understanding about the true cost of support, because it's an hourly rate that we get from local authorities, but that basically has to fund not only the support worker and their on cost, but recruitment, HR, finance, all of the back stuff that keeps our charity going. It's our core funding. So our challenge is that the petition, although I mean, everyone we speak to thinks it's great, it's being embraced, everyone endorses it, and we've had some media coverage, but it just isn't snowballing in the way that we'd hoped. So we're obviously doing something wrong. And we desperately, desperately want to affect change. And there's been a lot of other, you've probably heard on the news, there's a lot of other activity going on as well. But we're a really lean charity and we have little political weight or influence. So that's our challenge, really.
Thanks very much, Philippa. And if anyone would like to get involved and volunteer to help Philippa and the team, please do email anna@marketingkind.org to get involved. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Mark and Rory to begin answering the Q&As. Oh, I think you might be on mute, Mark.
Hi, Celia. Apologies. Yes, thank you. And thank you, Philippa. So I think we've got about 20 minutes. So we did have plans to invite people in to ask the questions directly, but I think I'm going to do a bit of paraphrasing for the sake of time. So I'm going to pick off a couple, and then we've got some pre-registered ones as well, and hand to Rory. So Louise asked the question, how, let me just find it now. Let me just find it again. Sorry. Where has it gone? Okay, how ready do you think marketing is to embrace neurodiversity, and what do you think needs to happen to accelerate this process? So I'd say two things. That's a great question, Louise. The first thing is, I actually see diversity in general as a conversation where the risk of marketing being marginalised is quite a key one, quite a big one. So if a marketing function is not literate from a commercial point of view, it will be seen as not very valuable by the CFO and the CEO and the board. And so that's long since been established, that unless a marketing function is commercially credible, it will be marginalised. I think the climate conversation and the diversity conversation are two further existential threats to marketing. If they're not in and leading and driving the conversation, they will be further marginalised. So I think it's a sort of it's a knife-edge thing. In practical terms, I think the answer to your question about whether marketing is well placed really depends as much as anything about the tenure of the CMO and the leadership team. And I can speak from this in terms of having 8.5 years in the job, and pretty much everyone's been around for that period of time. In that it's only after time that you get to the really good stuff and the long-term, you know, the building of long-term capability. And so I'll be honest with you, in the first 6 months of doing this job, or even the first year, this wasn't the thing I majored on, because you've got to earn your stripes, you've got to get credibility, you've got to have some short-term wins. And the sad truth is that the average tenure of the CMO is the lowest in the C-suite, and the trust of the CEO to the CMO is the lowest in the C-suite. So I think there's a bigger existential conversation about how marketing gets to the good stuff and starts to lead the core conversations that boards and excos are now looking into, including diversity and sustainability. So anyway, that's my 2 pence on that one. Just very quickly as well, Jackie asked, and again, I don't know if I pronounced that perfectly, it says, and thank you, Jackie, talks about his neurodiversity and the fact that he has a different instruction manual. Love that. The question is, how do I learn to change the words I use to help people to be aware that they have the ability to think differently? I think in this one, it goes a little bit back to what I said, which is you've got to give birth to the conversation, make it a normal part of the cultural lexicon. And there are a couple of things that you can do towards that. And one I've mentioned is getting speakers in. When Pip came in and in a room full of people said, who's dyslexic? because of the way she came across and talked about it so positively, a whole bunch of people who I didn't know were dyslexic put their hand up. But communing and forming a strand of like-minded neurodiverse people, giving it a presence, making it visible, making it a thing inside the organisation, i.e. don't make it a solo mission, because it might be quite unfruitful. This is definitely a case where coming together provides a greater outcome, but also looking for allyship. So hopefully you have some senior leaders, maybe even your CEO, who gets the conversation. And one of my proudest things for this year was getting Helen Taylor, who some of you will know, one of the best academic minds in this space in the world, in front of our CEO to talk about the importance of neurodiversity. And Penny got it, and it was a light bulb thing, and it sparked many other things subsequently. So I think hopefully there's a sort of, you shouldn't be, don't just bash your head against a brick wall would probably be the the summary of that. Keeping the pace going. One of the pre-submitted questions from Charlotte Skinner, Paul is his sister, mother, niece, anyway. It's easy to fall into autopilot when trying to solve problems. What mental prompts do you use, Rory Sutherland, to help you get out of that default thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it helps being in an ad agency, which is one of the very few working environments where perversity of thought is, is encouraged to some degree. So I often wonder, how in God's name would I have fared if I'd been in a place where, and it's not uncommon, you're punished for using different vocabulary or thinking about things from a different point of view. It's a really interesting question, actually. I think the essential thing I do, which is different, and I only learned this a few weeks ago, is that I read a lot of, I think the thing that really helped me was not only just working as a copywriter, but also I read a lot of evolutionary biology. I read books like The Selfish Gene, and there's a great book called The Economic Naturalist by Robert Frank, and so on. And Matt Ridley told me this, and it suddenly a penny dropped. He said, I can't remember who the biologist was, but a very famous biologist said, the point about biology is it's a science of exceptions. Okay, physics is a science of laws. You're looking to generalize. Whereas in biology, if you look at what Darwin did, he wandered around the Galapagos Islands and he looked at the things that didn't make sense, actually. He looked at, why do these finches all have different beaks, even though they live on islands which are only a few miles apart or whatever. And I think that's also true, that most people in business are looking to generalize. If you look at the phrase best practice, there are two things about it, okay? One person said very wisely, you should never say best practice, you should say better practices, because best practice is both static and it's singular, okay? And that's the quest for the single generalizable truth. And actually, I think most of us carry our kind of high school physics and maths education into the workplace, where we go, this is an optimization problem and there's a single right answer. And I think it's really, really frustrating for account people, by the way. I mean, and probably maddening for clients, which is, I almost have no sense of proportion. I'll go off and go, why is that thing green? If you think about the things that make you look like a good boardroom operator, it's a sense of proportion, it's, confidence, it's single-mindedness about metrics you pursue. And my whole approach is really that of the amateur naturalist, which is, this is weird, what's going on here? And I think that it's where you spend your attention and what you're looking for, because I think the real breakthroughs in psychology emerge like trying to puzzle out gusto. We could all have done this 10 years ago. Why is this $1 billion company? Okay, it's the simultaneity of the food arriving with the recipe. So now's your chance. It's really a kind of technology that solves a coordination problem, not a logistical problem. And so those are the kind of things which is looking at the things that are messy and looking at the outliers first. And I think so much information that reaches to the boardroom is an average, because if you think about what reaches the boardroom, the bigger you are as an organization, the only information that moves up to the top is information that aggregates. And numbers aggregate, but stories don't. So you lose the stories and you simply gain the aggregate information. And then the aggregate is presented as an average. And of course, the average may tell you nothing about reality at all. The average may even not exist. because I often argue this about mid-price retail. I go, look, I hate mid-price retail because basically you get a thrill from a bargain and you get a thrill from an extravagance, okay? You know, you get a bit of a kick from TK Maxx. By the way, for the blokes listening, there's some really good Brooks Brothers stuff on TK Maxx, right? Now, most Brits don't know what Brooks Brothers is, but if you go on TK Maxx and search for Brooks Brothers, I've already bought the stuff that fits, so I'm not worried about telling you this. You can game the system on TK Maxx for searching for high-end American brands that Brits haven't heard of. Just a bit of a, you know, anyway, bit of a handy tip. But you know, you get a kind of kick from shopping at Hermes, and you get a kick from TK Maxx. You don't really get a kick from mid-market retail. And so often being in the middle, which is where the aggregate tells you you need to be, is absolutely the wrong advice.
Yeah. No, brilliant point, Rory. Brooks Brothers, we'll all be hopping onto it again. Rory's not on a commission.
Smith Sweater reduced from 250 to 50 quid. There you go.
There you go. So I'm going to jump to a question from Chris about recruitment. So as a dyslexic, I fear that firstly, HR doesn't see talent but disability. Second, as HR software filters candidates, will neurodiverse talent be filtered out? It's a really good question because, of course, HR functions are often rewarded on running very sort of efficient recruitment processes. And it definitely is a thing. I think from my experience, there are ways in which certainly adverts at the start of a process, and of course where you place those adverts can help with this to some extent, but you definitely need an enlightened HR function. And what's increasingly happening is, I hope, HR functions open-minded to non-traditional mechanisms to recruit. Very specifically, doing away with interviews and CVs is a pretty good start. And that may sound dramatic, but there is evidence, and there's one very specific data point, which is Auticon as an organisation are not at all diverse. They only place people with autism into organisations, and they have absolutely dispatched with interviews and CVs. And what they do is task matches. Find an individual with the perfect skill set for a specific task. And just one example that we had was a chap who did some data work for us, that a team of 3 or 4 people had failed over a period of 6 months, and he came in and nailed it and through with lots of other value add. But because his brain was perfectly wired for that specific challenge. So I mean, I think these are maybe glimpses of what might be, but it does presuppose that you have an enlightened HR function who are prepared to look for, or be open-minded. And so again, it comes back to this giving birth to the conversation thing.
So Ogilvy has the pipe, which is deliberately intended to be another, basically another entry path that's complementary to what you might call the grad scheme. And, you know, among other things, it's found from almost nowhere, you know, the best young creative team we've ever had. I mean, I think one of the people who joined through the pipe ended up winning a Cannes Award in their first 6 months of work, which, I mean, God, is almost unprecedented. And it's partly because, of course, they're not the standard issue creative team. You know, they look at things differently. The Diamond Shreddies thing I showed at TED, that was actually a stand-up comedian who was freelancing in a creative department, and so had brought a completely different approach, you know, to how you'd approach an advertisement, really. And it really fascinates me because the language we use is really weird, because it's based on the assumptions of people at the top of the pyramid. And they always talk about equality of opportunity. And actually, capitalism isn't very good at equality of opportunity, because half of the outcomes of capitalism are luck, right? Okay. I mean, you know, to be honest, if you want a really surefire career, don't go into advertising, because really great people fail and pretty useless people succeed. It's a bit random. Okay. What we need to be talking about is not equality of opportunity, which is unattainable and also non-diverse. We need to be talking about variety of opportunity or breadth of opportunity, because that's where capitalism really scores. Because you can have, you know, there's a whole room in business, not in academia. Academia is selecting for qualities far narrower than the qualities that business actually requires. There's a job for you. I mean, seriously, okay, I shouldn't say this. There's a job for you in an ad agency if you're just seriously fucking charming, okay? Because an ecosystem of 100 people needs people who can sort of smooth over disagreements and can, you know, and just generally lift the mood of people around them. That's a worthwhile job. Okay, and so we're selecting on these incredibly, and the other thing that bothers me is who decides who's important? Management. Who who is therefore woefully over-inclined to see management as value add and other parts of the business as a cost? Management. Okay, that's why, by the way, care workers are paid too little. I also think call center workers, I think there should be, and I hope not everyone in direct line is listening here because there might be an insurrection. I think it should be possible to earn 100 grand a year working in a call center. Okay, because if you're that seriously good, I mean, I'll tell you a lovely experience about this. Okay, this is true of service businesses. Royal Mail under Alex Batchelor did some survey to find out what were the things that really determined your brand attitude towards Royal Mail as a brand. And they looked at the advertising, they looked at all these things. There's one thing above everything else that determines your approach, your affection for Royal Mail as a brand. It's whether you like your postman. Okay? And we totally undervalue frontline workers because the management view of the world is that important value creating decisions are taken in management at the top, because they've all been educated at some stupid MBA place to believe that. And they see the people at the front line as a cost. And it actually leads to that thing, which I think was brilliantly said by the guy at GE, who said that you end up with an organization which is oriented with its tongue towards the CEO and its arse towards the customer. And I think that's it's so worryingly true, because I mean I've had call center, you know, a really good experience of the British Gas guy who comes around and fixes my boiler. Now every time I've had British Gas, I can't remember if it's called service care or home care, but I've had that British Gas thing where your boiler's looked after. And every time the guy who comes around to service the boiler is utterly brilliant and really charming. And to be honest, I've been with them for 13, 14 years. That's the prime determinant of why I'm with them. Okay? And the penguin. But I mean, I think if we understand these things, this idea that value and this idea that value is sort of generated in the C-suite, it strikes me as unbelievably self-serving belief, really. I mean, don't forget, when we all started work, when I first went into advertising, the people who wrote the ads were the best paid people in the building. You know, if you worked in journalism, there were journalists who were paid more than the editor or the manager. If you went into medicine, the doctors were the highest paid people in the hospital, right? And we've created this weird self-serving administrative class, which is actually, it's like Marx's idea of capital, but it isn't capital. It's like an extractive class in between capital and labor. And you know, it's become absurdly bloated, but it's also become incredibly in love with its own narrative about how value is created. Oh, you're on mute, Mark, sorry.
Yeah, so Rory, if I may say so, you've been very graphic with your examples this evening, but love it nonetheless. I'm just going to jump to a question from Claire Kennedy. So building on your point about recruitment, what was your view on Dominic Cummings' recruitment ad looking for misfits? So great question, Claire. For those who weren't aware, Dominic Cummings, bless him, back in January said that we were looking for misfits and oddballs, I think, or something like that. Weirdos and misfits it was, for new jobs in number 10. Yeah, I think he was onto something. If you think about to Bletchley Park and Turing, which apparently is the impact of Bletchley Park is now being contested. But anyway, I think he was onto something. But I think there should have, brackets sociopaths, not to get too political, probably wasn't part of what he meant. And so it's unfortunate that these two things have been conflated. But anyway, I won't get political about that. We've got one more question. Time for one more question.
There's actually a wonderful thing about Bletchley Park, I will tell you, which is when Nespresso was created, it was outside Nestle. When IBM created the PC division, they put it in Boca Raton because the Watson, who is the head of IBM, said, if we put it close to head office will kill it. It's got to be a coastline away. And with Bletchley Park, this is an example of the British aristocracy in 1941 or whatever. The guy in MI6 bought the house himself, okay? Because he thought, if I try and get this through the bloody bureaucracy, it'll take ages. So he just went and bought the bloody house. And, so it is interesting how it's very, very difficult to get these, for large organizations to create innovative kind of skunk works without killing the very thing they're trying to create.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that talks about ripping up the rule book, buying it.
Yeah, bought the house.
The last question, which will see us home, because we're going to hand back to Celia in about 5 minutes. So, Rory, this will probably hopefully we've given everyone a bit of a bit of brain food. But it's a really good question here. Have you got any examples of agency structures that have ripped up the rulebook on line management?
Yeah, Howell Henry was interesting on this. Increasingly, to be honest, we work in a kind of matrix way in an agency. And that's particularly true, I think, on international business, where the ultimate head on the account may not even be in the same country. I also work now within Ogilvy Consulting, which is very interesting because it's a group of people who tend to be quite, it's all very collegiate. I mean, I have no idea of the relative seniority of anybody, to be absolutely honest. And actually, creative people were always very unconcerned with, creative people only had 2 job titles for accountants, for account handlers, good ones and shit ones. They weren't remotely interested in the seniority. There were people who got good work done and out, and there were people who didn't. And I think that hierarchy where the only way to move upwards is to take on managerial responsibilities is terrible. And of course, it partly comes from the destruction. Most downsizing has hit middle management. So you end up with these 2 extremes. I also think we'll have to rethink the whole thing because of the Zoom revolution. I think that for professional services companies and for white collar workers, this is as important as the internet. The fact that the whole world's had a crash course in remote and flexible working, but also in terms of, I don't know how many countries I've been to today. I've definitely been to New York. Hold on. Yeah, I've been to New York, I've been to Binghamton, and I've been to Sydney, Australia already today. Okay. So that's going to change things even further. And it also places a huge value on trust, which I always believed in anyway. I always think if you're micromanaging people, to be honest, you've got the wrong people, or there's something wrong about you. Because that's ultimately, the trust in people to essentially motivate themselves is everything now. And so, no, I think we'll have to tear up the rule book again, but I think you're right, which is that requirement for advancement that you move up a kind of hierarchy chain is, strangely, it's worse than it used to be, which is odd because you'd think it was a bit of a legacy of, it was a bit of a legacy of the military, to be honest. I mean, the structure of a lot of corporations, it almost borrowed from military structures. And I think we'll have to reinvent it all over again, by the way.
Yep, spot on, Rory. So we are bang on time. I'm just going to do one thing before handing back to Celia, though, which is there's a great comment from Priya. Again, apologies, I don't know if I pronounced that right. I heard a quote the other day, labels are for jam jars, not for people. Haven't got time to answer the question, but I'm going to put in the chat box a great video which talks to our unconscious biases. And it's actually a Coke ad, but as far as it goes, it's pretty elegant because I don't want to give too much away, but it's along that theme. Priya, it sparked something I saw the other day. So I'll put a link in the chat box to a 2-minute YouTube video, and we can all take away how the fact inherently, as Rory has said, we can't help but have our own unconscious biases. But with that, I think, Celia, remarkably, we are bang on time. Back to you.
Thanks very much.
The next intro, over to you.
Thanks for getting us back on track, guys. Thank you. So with that, we're now going to hand over to Nick. Nick is the CEO of the British Dyslexia Association, and we've asked him to join us this evening to tell us a little bit more about the work that they do, and again, how marketers can get involved and help them. So over to you, Nick.
Thank you. So yesterday I was talking to a medical student who's on the verge of becoming a doctor and hoping to be a surgeon, but he's been refused some additional time in his exams because the examining board does not really understand dyslexia. And the risk is he could end up not achieving his potential, which has a knock-on impact on the thousands of future patients whose lives he could save or change. So the British Dyslexia Association is a national charity that is the voice of dyslexic people. We provide assessments for all ages, support for schools and workplaces, and we lobby to change government policy. In 2021, we will be launching our new strategy, and we are ambitious for people with dyslexia. We urgently need to change the perceptions of dyslexia across society. We want to focus on benefits similar to those you have heard about this evening. We want to engage more deeply with our audiences and understand them better, because we want to build the movement we need to change those perceptions. So we would really love your help and support in making this happen, whether you're a marketing data specialist, an audience analyst, a marketing strategy guru, I think we've been hearing one today, or just brilliant at engagement with customers. You can help 6 million people with dyslexia. We've been building our marketing function at the British Dyslexia Association, and in 2022 we will be marking our 50th anniversary. So improving engagement is crucial before we launch a big campaign to change those perceptions of dyslexia. So please put your skills to use, making a difference for millions of people and connecting us with millions of people with dyslexia. Please get in touch with me, Nick Posford, Chief Exec at the British Dyslexia Association.